My name is Marcus Webb, and I'm 63 years old. I spent 40 years as a certified public accountant, auditing corporations, analyzing financial statements, and catching numerical inconsistencies that most people would miss. Attention to detail is the first thing you learn in accounting. It's the skill that separates the professionals from the amateurs. When I retired 3 years ago, I thought I'd left all that behind. I thought my days of scrutinizing spreadsheets and investigating financial discrepancies were over. I moved to Silverbrook Heights, a luxury community of 240 homes nestled in the rolling hills just outside the city, a place that promised peace, manicured lawns, and freedom from the stress of my career. My wife Dorothy and I had dreamed about this place for years. We'd driven past the gates, watched the construction, imagined ourselves sitting on the back patio sipping wine and watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. We sold our old house, packed our lives into boxes, and moved into a beautiful colonial-style home with white shutters and a wraparound porch that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. Dorothy immediately started planting flower gardens. I spent my days reading books I'd never had time for, taking long walks through the community, and genuinely believing that retirement would be the reward I'd earned after 4 decades of work. That peaceful existence lasted exactly 4 months. It ended on a Tuesday morning in October when I received a phone call from my bank, a call that would unravel a conspiracy so dark and so meticulously hidden that it would shake my faith in everything I thought I knew about community, trust, and the sanctity of personal information. The voice on the phone belonged to a woman named Jennifer Torres, a fraud specialist with my bank, and her tone was urgent but carefully controlled, the way professionals speak when they're delivering bad news they've had to deliver too many times before. "Mr. Webb, we've detected unauthorized activity on your account," she said, and I felt my stomach drop because I knew immediately that this was more serious than a simple credit card fraud or identity mix-up. Jennifer explained that there had been multiple wire transfers totaling $47,000 sent to overseas accounts over the past 3 months, transfers that I hadn't authorized, transfers that shouldn't have been possible because the account was linked to my phone for 2-factor authentication. But here's where it got strange, where my accounting brain started firing off warning signals like a smoke detector in a burning building. The transfers were made using login credentials that had been changed without my knowledge, credentials that someone had used to rebuild my entire financial profile. The fraudsters hadn't just accessed my account, Jennifer explained. They'd gone deeper, much deeper. They'd obtained my social security number, my date of birth, my mother's maiden name, the kind of intimate biographical details that I'd only ever provided to banks, insurance companies, and government agencies. They'd opened credit cards in my name. They'd taken out a personal loan for $30,000. They'd applied for a mortgage on a property I didn't own. The scope of the fraud was almost breathtaking in its thoroughness. The perpetrators hadn't just stolen money. They'd stolen my identity and were in the process of building a completely false financial life in my name. Jennifer referred me to the Federal Trade Commission, to credit reporting agencies, to law enforcement. But as I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my living room, I realized that all those agencies would move slowly, would process my complaint through bureaucratic channels, would eventually catch up to this fraud, but only after the damage had already been done. My accounting instincts took over. I immediately called my other banks, my credit card companies, the investment firms where I'd managed my retirement accounts. The results were chilling. Someone had attempted to access my investment portfolio, had tried to initiate wire transfers that had been blocked by security protocols, had essentially tried to drain every liquid asset I possessed. This wasn't random. This wasn't a data breach from a retailer or a single compromised password. This was targeted, surgical, and executed by someone who knew exactly which accounts to hit and how to hit them. I called Dorothy at her volunteer position at the community library and asked her to come home immediately. When she arrived, I showed her everything. I walked her through the fraudulent accounts, the unauthorized transactions, the credit inquiries that had been filed in her name as well. That's when my hands started shaking with a different kind of fear. If they had my information, if they had Dorothy's information, if they had this level of access to our financial lives, then somewhere in the chain of information, someone had given them access. Someone had either stolen our data, or worse, had been given access intentionally. I spent that entire night on the phone and at my computer. I called the credit reporting agencies and placed fraud alerts on both our files. I filed reports with the Federal Trade Commission. I contacted the police department and filed an official complaint about the identity theft. But even as I was doing all this, my brain was working on the real question. Where did this information come from? Who had access to my social security number, my address, my banking information, my biographical details, and most importantly, why me? I'm not a wealthy man. My retirement savings are comfortable but not extraordinary. I don't have assets that would justify this kind of targeted fraud. So either I was chosen randomly from a data breach, or I was chosen because someone knew me, someone who understood my financial situation and decided I was a good target. That thought terrified me more than anything else. The next morning, while Dorothy was still sleeping, exhausted from the stress of the previous day, I made a coffee and sat down at my desk with a pad of paper and a pen. It was instinct, the old accountant's instinct to organize information, to create timelines, to search for patterns. I wrote down everything that had happened. I wrote down the dates of the fraudulent transactions. I wrote down the accounts that had been targeted and the ones that hadn't been. I wrote down the names of every person I'd interacted with since moving to Silverbrook Heights, and that's when something struck me. That's when the first real piece of the puzzle fell into place. 3 months ago, I'd attended a community meeting hosted by the Silverbrook Heights HOA. The meeting was about annual budget review and new community initiatives. I'd signed in at the door, as all residents were required to do. I'd provided my phone number to the registration table so they could update their community directory, and I'd filled out a contact form that asked for my address, my email, and my phone number. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. These were routine things, standard practices at community events. But now, sitting in the morning silence of my retirement home, I started to wonder. Who had access to those forms? Who had access to the community directory? Who was responsible for managing the personal information of 240 families living in Silverbrook Heights? The answer was obvious. The HOA staff, and specifically the office manager, a woman named Patricia Simmons, who'd been warm and welcoming when I'd met her during my first week as a resident. She'd helped us navigate the community rules, had provided us with the directory, had made us feel at home. She'd been nothing but kind. But kindness, I was beginning to understand, could be a mask. Kindness could hide something much darker underneath. I spent the next 3 days researching identity theft, data security, and the specific details of how someone might access resident information from an HOA office. I talked to Jennifer Torres at the bank again, and this time I asked her a different kind of question. Was there any way to trace where the fraudsters had obtained my personal information? She explained that data could be stolen in countless ways, through phishing emails, through malware on computers, through physical documents that had been stolen from files. But the specificity of my case, the fact that they knew my social security number and other deeply private information, suggested that they didn't just have access to some general database. They had access to something more intimate, something that only specific people would have. That's when I decided that I needed to get into the HOA office myself. I needed to see what information they kept, how they stored it, who had access to it, and whether there were any signs that someone had been accessing it for purposes other than legitimate community management. On a Thursday afternoon, I walked into the Silverbrook Heights administrative office with a legal pad and my best innocent expression. The office was small, professionally decorated with photos of the community and plaques celebrating various HOA achievements. Patricia Simmons sat behind a desk working on a computer, and when she saw me, she smiled that warm smile that I now suspected of being false. "Mr. Webb, how nice to see you. Is there something I can help you with?" I told her that I was interested in understanding the HOA's financial structure, that I'd spent my career in accounting and was curious about how community associations managed their budgets. It was a plausible lie, the kind that wouldn't raise suspicion. Patricia seemed pleased by my interest. She showed me some financial documents, explained the budget allocation, and generally made herself seem like a helpful, transparent community manager. But while she was talking, I was looking around the office. I was noting the location of the filing cabinets, the computer setup, the documents visible on desks. I was looking for signs of how resident information was stored and protected. What I saw made me deeply uncomfortable. On a shelf behind Patricia's desk, I could see a stack of community directories, each containing the names, addresses, phone numbers, and email addresses of every resident in Silverbrook Heights. The directories appeared to be unsecured, accessible to anyone who walked into the office. More concerning was Patricia's computer setup. Her screen was angled in such a way that I could partially see it from where I sat, and what I saw disturbed me. She had multiple files open, databases that appeared to contain resident information, financial records, and what looked like personal biographical details. There was no privacy screen protecting her computer from viewing angles. Anyone in that office or anyone who could get into that office would have access to sensitive resident data. Over the next week, I began a careful investigation. I talked casually with other residents, asking them if they'd noticed any unusual financial activity. I was careful about how I phrased the question, making it sound like I was making conversation rather than conducting an investigation, but the results were shocking. Out of 15 residents I spoke with, 7 of them reported suspicious activity in their accounts or credit reports. 7 out of 15. That wasn't coincidence, that was a pattern. I met privately with one of these residents, a woman named Sandra Mitchell, who discovered that someone had opened 3 credit cards in her name and charged over $12,000 before the fraud was detected. Sandra had contacted the police, but the police had told her that identity theft cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute and that she should focus on reporting to the credit agencies rather than the criminal justice system. The casualness of this dismissal made my blood boil. We're not talking about a pickpocket. We're talking about organized fraud affecting multiple people in the same community. That pattern should have triggered an investigation. That pattern should have had law enforcement asking serious questions. But instead, each victim was told their case was individual, isolated, something they needed to handle themselves. That's when I realized that this conspiracy, if it existed, was relying on the fragmentation of the justice system. The fraud was small enough at the individual level that no single victim seemed worth pursuing, but collectively, across 7 victims in one small community, it added up to something much larger. I started keeping a notebook, something I'd done throughout my accounting career. I documented every piece of information I gathered. I noted the dates when residents reported fraud. I created a timeline and noticed that the fraudulent activity had accelerated over the past 3 months. I researched the backgrounds of the HOA staff, looking for anything that might indicate financial desperation or criminal history. Patricia Simmons' background seemed clean on the surface. She'd been with the HOA for 4 years. She had good references from her previous positions. But I dug deeper. I found her social media accounts and discovered posts that didn't match her financial situation. She was posting photos of expensive vacations, designer handbags, luxury watches. For an HOA office manager earning an average salary, she was living a lifestyle that required significantly more income than she was supposed to have. That's when I knew I was onto something. That's when I understood that Patricia Simmons was the key to understanding what was really happening in Silverbrook Heights. I hired a private investigator named Marcus Kane, a man with 25 years of experience in financial crimes investigation. I met with him in a coffee shop far from Silverbrook Heights, a place where no one would recognize me. I brought my notebook, my timeline, my documentation of the 7 victims I'd identified, and my theory about Patricia Simmons and the HOA office. Marcus listened carefully as I laid out everything I'd discovered. He didn't interrupt me. He didn't dismiss my concerns. Instead, he nodded slowly and then asked me the question that would launch this investigation into something far more serious than I'd imagined. Have you considered that it might not be just Patricia Simmons? That it might be multiple people? That there might be an entire network operating out of that office? The possibility had occurred to me, but hearing it stated so directly, with such confidence, made the whole situation suddenly feel much more sinister. Marcus spent 2 weeks investigating. He analyzed the patterns of fraudulent activity. He obtained subpoenas for HOA office records and employee information. He even managed to get copies of security footage from inside the HOA office, which is when we discovered something that changed everything. The security footage showed Patricia Simmons on multiple evenings, long after the office had closed for the day, accessing filing cabinets and computers. But she wasn't alone. On 4 separate occasions, she was joined by another person, Michael Torres, the HOA treasurer. Michael, who'd signed off on community budgets. Michael, who was responsible for managing community funds and financial records. Michael, who had full access to every piece of information in the HOA office and the ability to move money without raising suspicion. Together, they were photographing resident documents. They were writing down information. They were systematically extracting the personal data of every resident in Silverbrook Heights. Marcus brought this information to the FBI. He explained the scope of the operation, the number of victims, and the fact that the fraud was being perpetrated from inside a position of community trust. The FBI opened a formal investigation and assigned a federal agent named Jennifer Carlson to the case. Jennifer was a specialist in white-collar crime, and when I met with her, I could see the professional anger in her eyes. "This is bold," she said, reviewing my documentation. "They're stealing from people while living in the same community as them, while attending community meetings with them, while managing their money in an official capacity. It's a complete violation of trust." Jennifer explained that what Marcus and I had uncovered was actually larger than we realized. The fraud wasn't limited to Silverbrook Heights. Their investigation had discovered similar patterns in 3 other communities in the area, 3 other HOAs, multiple perpetrators, a network of HOA employees systematically stealing the identities of residents for profit. The scale of it was staggering. Over 500 victims, millions of dollars in fraudulent charges, and years of planning and execution that had gone undetected because the victims were scattered, because they didn't know to look for patterns, because the system wasn't designed to catch this kind of crime. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Here's where I discovered something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the people I lived with. When Jennifer's team moved to arrest Patricia Simmons and Michael Torres, when they raided the HOA office and seized computers and documents, they discovered something that suggested the conspiracy ran even deeper. They found evidence that other HOA board members knew what was happening. Not everyone, not all of them, but at least 2 other board members had received payoffs from the stolen money. They'd been receiving regular deposits into offshore accounts, amounts that were carefully hidden but substantial enough to suggest that they were being paid for their silence. The community I'd moved to for peace and retirement had become a place of organized crime. The trust I'd placed in community institutions had been systematically betrayed by people in positions of authority. As the investigation unfolded, as federal charges were filed, as the media descended on Silverbrook Heights with cameras and microphones, I realized that I was no longer just a retired accountant who discovered fraud affecting his own finances. I was a witness to something larger, something that revealed the vulnerability of community systems and the dangers of placing trust without oversight. What I didn't anticipate was the level of desperation that Patricia Simmons and her network would display once they knew they were being investigated. Over the course of a single week, the situation escalated from financial crime investigation to something that resembled a criminal organization actively trying to suppress evidence and silence witnesses. The first sign of serious trouble came when my computer was hacked. I found that my email account had been accessed, that files on my hard drive had been deleted, that someone had attempted to install malware designed to track my activities and monitor my communications. It was sophisticated, professional-grade malware that suggested someone with serious technical expertise was trying to erase my digital footprint and everything I'd documented about the fraud. At the same time, Dorothy received threatening messages. Not direct threats of violence, but implications that were unmistakable. Messages suggesting that revealing information about the HOA could result in consequences for me, for her, for our family. The messages were anonymous, sent through encrypted apps that couldn't be easily traced, but the implication was clear. Stay silent or face the consequences. I reported everything to Agent Jennifer Carlson, and her response was immediate. She arranged for federal protection agents who began watching our house, who accompanied us when we left our property, who made it clear that we were now considered witnesses under federal protection. The community's reaction to the investigation was divided and complex. Some residents were grateful that the fraud had been discovered, grateful that the network was being dismantled before more damage could be done. But others, particularly those with connections to the HOA board or those who'd benefited from the corruption in subtle ways, began attacking me publicly. They claimed I was exaggerating the situation. They claimed I was trying to destroy the community reputation for personal gain. One particularly vicious campaign started on the community Facebook page, attacking me as a troublemaker who'd invaded people's privacy, who'd overreached in his investigation, who'd brought federal agents into what should have been a local matter. The irony was almost surreal. I was being attacked for reporting fraud while the people I'd reported were being arrested and charged with federal crimes. But that's how these situations work. In the absence of complete information, people fill the gaps with their own narratives, and some of those narratives made me into the villain in this story. Things escalated further when Patricia Simmons, facing federal charges that could result in 15 years in prison, made a decision that put my life in serious danger. She attempted to flee. Federal agents caught her at an airport with a fake passport and over $200,000 in cash, clearly headed toward a country with no extradition treaty with the United States. During her arrest, she made a statement that caused immediate concern. She'd reached out to people outside the immediate network, people who owed her favors, people she'd apparently paid from her fraudulent proceeds, and she'd put a price on my head. Specifically, she'd offered $50,000 to anyone who could intimidate me enough to recant my testimony before the federal trial. When Jennifer Carlson informed me of this detail, her professional composure slipped slightly, and I saw genuine concern in her eyes. "Mr. Webb, you need to take this very seriously. We've increased protection, but I want you to understand the danger you're in. You're the central witness in a federal prosecution. Without your testimony, certain elements of this case become significantly harder to prove. Patricia Simmons knows this. She knows that removing you from the picture would substantially weaken the prosecution. For 2 weeks, I lived under effective house arrest. Federal agents maintained constant surveillance of our property. Dorothy and I couldn't leave without armed protection. We couldn't attend community events. We couldn't live anything resembling a normal life. The fear was real and immediate. Every knock on the door made my heart race. Every unexpected sound in the night sent adrenaline surging through my system. I'd spent my entire career dealing with numbers and calculations, with the orderly world of accounting where everything had a clear answer and a verifiable solution. Now I was living in a world where trust had been weaponized, where people I'd considered community members had attempted to destroy me financially, and where my safety depended on the competence of federal law enforcement. The situation changed dramatically when Michael Torres, facing the same federal charges as Patricia Simmons, but showing more concern about his prospects in prison, decided to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a plea deal. Michael was the one with the technical expertise. Michael was the one who'd set up the systems for accessing resident data. Michael was the one who could provide detailed information about how the entire network operated. His cooperation filled in gaps that my investigation had left unfilled. It gave the prosecution a roadmap of the entire criminal enterprise. It revealed connections to organized crime figures outside the community, people who were using the identity theft ring as a money laundering operation. It showed that what had seemed like a localized fraud was actually part of something much larger, much darker, much more systematically organized. With Michael's cooperation, the threat level against me decreased significantly. The federal prosecutors no longer needed to rely as heavily on my testimony, because Michael could testify to the same facts from an insider's perspective. Patricia's offer of $50,000 for my intimidation suddenly became less important, because the case didn't depend entirely on a single witness. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe without feeling like I was about to suffocate. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Patricia Simmons, Michael Torres, and 3 other co-conspirators faced multiple federal charges, including conspiracy, identity theft, wire fraud, and money laundering. The courtroom was packed with media, with community members who wanted to see justice served, and with victims who needed to hear that someone was finally being held accountable for what had been done to them. I testified for 3 days, walking through every piece of evidence I'd uncovered, explaining my methodology, describing how I'd realized that individual fraud cases were actually part of a larger pattern. The defense attorneys tried to discredit me. They suggested that I'd conducted an improper investigation, that I'd violated privacy expectations, that my findings were unreliable because I wasn't a trained law enforcement professional, but the evidence was overwhelming. The documentation I'd carefully organized and presented was meticulous. The timeline I'd constructed was accurate. The pattern I'd identified was undeniable. The jury deliberated for 4 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for all 5 defendants. Patricia Simmons received a sentence of 16 years in federal prison. Michael Torres, for his corporation, received a lighter sentence of 8 years. The 3 other co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years, depending on their level of involvement. The sentencing was covered extensively by local media, and for the first time I felt like the community narrative began to shift. People who'd attacked me on social media during the investigation began to understand that I'd been right, that I'd uncovered something real and serious, that I'd sacrificed my safety and my peace to hold criminals accountable. The victims of the fraud, all of them, collectively received restitution of over $3 million as the convicted criminals' assets were seized and liquidated to pay back the people they'd stolen from. Sandra Mitchell, the woman who'd first shared her fraud story with me, received complete restitution of the $12,000 that had been stolen in her name. Dozens of other victims reported similar restoration of their financial situations. My own case was resolved. The $47,000 that had been stolen from my account was recovered. The fraudulent accounts opened in my name were closed and removed from my credit report. My identity was reclaimed and restored to legitimacy, but the real impact of this case extended far beyond financial restoration. The investigation revealed systemic vulnerabilities in how HOAs protect resident information. Multiple municipalities changed their regulations around HOA record-keeping and access protocols. New standards were established requiring encryption of sensitive data, regular security audits, and criminal background checks for HOA employees. What had started as my personal struggle against fraud had become something that protected entire communities from similar abuse. 6 months after the sentencing, I met with Agent Jennifer Carlson one final time. The investigation was officially closed. The prosecutions were complete. My role as a witness was finished. We met at the same coffee shop where I'd first explained my concerns to Marcus Kane, the private investigator who'd helped turn my theories into evidence. Jennifer handed me a folder containing all the documentation from the case, now that it was public record. "Mr. Webb," she said, "I've worked in white-collar crime for 20 years. I've seen people caught committing fraud, but rarely have I seen someone show the level of diligence and courage that you demonstrated. You sacrificed your retirement piece. You risked your safety. You sat through threats and intimidation. You did that because you believed in accountability and justice. That matters. More than you might realize, it matters." After Jennifer left, I sat alone in the coffee shop holding that folder, thinking about Dorothy and the life we'd been planning. The peace we'd anticipated in retirement had been replaced by fear and stress and the burden of being entangled in a criminal investigation. But I also knew that without my willingness to dig deeper, without my accountant's instinct to find patterns and inconsistencies, the crime would have continued. More people would have been victimized, the network would have expanded. The trust that communities are built on would have continued to be weaponized against vulnerable people. When I returned home that evening, Dorothy was tending her flower gardens. She'd continued to plant and nurture them throughout the entire ordeal, and they'd transformed our backyard into something beautiful, a physical manifestation of resilience and the determination to keep growing despite the darkness around you. We sat on our porch as the sun set, watching the sky paint itself in impossible colors, and Dorothy reached over and squeezed my hand. "We did good," she said simply. "That's what I'm going to remember about our retirement. We did something that mattered, and she was right. Sometimes the cost of doing what's right is higher than you anticipate. Sometimes justice requires sacrifice. But when you look back on your life, when you consider the choices you made and the stand you took, Knowing that you fought against corruption and helped protect others makes every sacrifice worth it. The identity theft conspiracy in Silverbrook Heights became a case study used in fraud prevention training across the country. My investigation methods were taught in accounting schools as an example of how careful analysis and pattern recognition can uncover organized crime. The community slowly rebuilt itself. A new HOA board was elected with stricter oversight and transparency protocols. Residents learned to be more careful about what personal information they provided to community institutions. Trust was rebuilt, but it was a different kind of trust now, one that was coupled with verification and accountability. A year after the trial ended, I received a letter from one of the fraud victims, a young couple who'd had their identity stolen and nearly lost their house when the fraudsters attempted to refinance the mortgage. In the letter, they told me that they'd used their restitution money to finally afford the down payment on a new house, one that they could buy free and clear without fear of discovery. They thanked me for my persistence, for my refusal to accept that their suffering was just individual misfortune. That letter reminded me why I'd done what I'd done. That letter made the sacrifice meaningful. I framed it and hung it in my office, a permanent reminder that one person's commitment to truth and accountability can transform entire communities and give hope to people who've had hope stripped away by betrayal. Life in Silverbrook Heights settled into a new normal, one that was quieter than retirement was supposed to be, but ultimately more authentic. Dorothy and I remained in our home. We became advocates for community transparency and resident protection. We volunteered as part of the new HOA Oversight Committee, ensuring that the systems put in place to prevent future fraud were actually being followed. The peace we'd sought in retirement came eventually, just not in the way we'd expected. It came not from isolation from community problems, but from being deeply involved in solving them. Sometimes the most meaningful retirement is one spent protecting others.